Welcome to this online lecture where we're going to look at HTML, in particular HTML5, give you a little bit of context behind this technology that you've already had some exposure to, look at some of the HTML5 features and just do a little bit of a recap on the core HTML elements. Okay, so you may or may not recognize this image. This is from the 2012 Olympic opening ceremony, and part of the ceremony, all the kind of dancing, what have you, there was a sequence where there's this strange building in the middle of the Olympic stadium, and it lifted up to reveal this guy, which seemed to perplex quite a few people. But you of course all know who this is. This is Tim Berners-Lee, and Tim Berners-Lee is credited with being the inventor of the World Wide Web. Now the story goes that he was working at CERN, which is the Centre European Research Nucléaire in Geneva, where they have a massive particle accelerator. These pieces of kit cost millions and millions of pounds, and there's lots of academics and engineers and researchers from around the globe working on this technology. And they needed, when Tim Berners-Lee was working there, they had no standardized way of communicating with each other. So he came up with the idea of having a standardized document format known as hypertext markup language, HTML, and then a standardized way that these documents could be viewed, a web browser, and a standardized way that these documents could be distributed via servers, which became known as web servers, via HTTP, so Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So all the core stuff that you and I use every day. And interestingly, he submitted a paper on this suggestion to his boss, and his boss apparently wrote at the top of the paper, "Vague but exciting." So the way that Tim Berners-Lee gave us the web as we know it, it sat on top of the existing internet infrastructure, which is a kind of American military type concept, and it just used that existing infrastructure to send HTML documents in kind of basic summary over HTTP. If you want to know more about this, I'll link to this elsewhere, but this is a really great program that was done by the BBC a few years ago, and they do this. There's a little sequence here, it's no more than 2 minutes long, as you can see there, which explains how they went about building the web at CERN and the logic behind it. So the idea that you could type in a web address, a URL, to connect to a server somewhere in order to access the web page that you're after. And those two bits of technology that were needed for this to work, the web server and the web browser, they're both familiar to us hopefully. And those the two original ones of those came from CERN. And I think the real genius of what Tim Berners-Lee did was that he realised that this was just software, and he gave the software away for free initially to kind of academic and research organisations who started communicating with each other, and then it spread like wildfire, so that we get to the point today where we're all dependent on these technologies. Incidentally, a bit of nerdy info on the desk there. When they did this at the Olympic opening ceremony, that's the Next computer. Next computers were the company that Steve Jobs went to after he initially got chucked out of Apple before his glorious return, and they were high-end machines at the time in the mid-90s, and they were using those at CERN to develop the first browsers and web servers. So great attention to detail there from the producers of the Olympic opening ceremony. So why is this interest of us? Well, it's important to put this stuff in context. It's nice to know this stuff, and what you should also be aware of is that Tim Berners-Lee is the chair of an organisation called the World Wide Web Consortium, and it's this organisation that is responsible for setting the standards that we as humble developers get to use day in day out when we're developing web pages. So it's an international community of member organisations, and they develop the standards, and so for things like HTML and CSS, and things like the DOM, which relates to JavaScript, which we'll get to later on. So you can go to the W3C site, and can browse through all the standards as developed and the interesting projects that they're working on. So just very quickly give you a little overview as to what happened in the web world after the initial creation of these technologies at CERN. So they came up with HTML and HTTP around about 1995, and by about 1999 HTML had reached a version 4, and it was announced by W3C that that was going to be the last version of HTML. Seems a little bit odd 21 years ago, but we're still using that technology. But what happened is, in the early noughties, W3C decided that they would push this concept of HTML known as XHTML, which in summary was HTML that followed XML standards. You can still see the information about this on the W3 site. It's still there, XML at the time was a very, very popular format for communicating, moving data around the web. It's still in use. We'll talk about it later, in particular in relation to JSON and where JSON has superseded it. But W3C very smitten by this XML construct, so much so that in 2004 they decided that they would release something called XHTML2, where that was problematic and caused a little schism in the web community, was that it would fundamentally break lots of existing pages. So that happy community that W3C initially set up kind of broke away a little bit with the WHAT, as they were known, the Web Hypertext Application Technology Group, including Mozilla and Opera and others. They broke away from W3C and started to work on their own future version of HTML with what they wanted to see in the HTML standard. Now, to his credit, Tim Berners-Lee a couple of years later turned around and accepted that what Mozilla and others were up to was perfectly valid, and they actually had a really good understanding of what developers wanted from these technologies. So they quietly dropped XHTML2 and collectively worked on something called HTML5, which is the standard that you be most familiar with. That came to kind of real public knowledge. Even people who are outside the industry started to hear about HTML5 in 2010 with the launch of the iPad. The iPad at the time was notorious for not supporting the Adobe Flash player, and Steve Jobs, CEO at Apple of course at the time, released a famous memo called Thoughts on Flash, an open letter where he criticised Adobe's Flash platform, and in doing so he indicated that anything that could be done by Flash and other plugins at the time could be done by HTML5, CSS and JavaScript, because these were open standards. So that gave a massive push to the adoption of HTML5, CSS as JavaScript by the browser vendors in an open standard way to replace the requirement on plugins. So it really pushed HTML5 into the mainstream, so much so that HTML5 became a blanket term that really meant kind of modern JavaScript, as well as the HTML markup language that we'll be looking at in a second. As an aside, W3C are a little bit bureaucratic at times, a little bit slow moving, so it was perceived, someone at W3C commented around about that time that the standard would be ready by 2022, which was seen as a little bit of a joke, given that most of the browsers were already supporting it. So somebody set up a website called Is It Ready Yet? It may still be out there, I've not checked for a while, and they had a counter counting down to that date when W3C said HTML5 will be ready. The irony was, of course, that the counter was built in HTML5 itself, just to prove that technology was already mature and working out there in the wild. So what? What's all this got to do with us? Well, the important thing about HTML5 was how it was developer driven. So remember, it was Mozilla who broke off, who had a real close working relationship with developers, and they knew what developers wanted, what developers found frustrating from HTML, and they worked to add those functionality into the tags to make the life of developers easier. and it reflected what we wanted to do, what we wanted to get out of HTML. And you've probably seen from that kind of timeline, of course, we can use it now, and you've been using it probably for all your time in HTML if you've only come to it in recent times, because you do so by just putting this what's known as doc type declaration at the top of your web page. So this element here with the exclamation mark, known as a doc type declaration, and it's a statement of intent from you as a developer to say that you intend to use the latest and greatest version of HTML, currently HTML5, within your document. Quite whether your code is up to that standard is up to you, and the quality of the code you produce, but this doc type declaration is a statement of intent. So if you go to any kind of modern web page these days, you will see that up at the top. When we switch and we go to the code view, you will see that you will have that doc type declaration there. Okay, so that indicate that what we've got there is a HTML5 page. So the key features of HTML5 itself, as the tags, were the ability to it came with semantics, it came with multimedia support, it came with form improvements, and it came with various APIs to help us out as developers. Right, so let's just dig into this doc type thing a little bit further, because you may historically come across older ones. I've shown you this one in the wild there on a live site. If you come across these older doc type declarations, these are to do with the earlier versions of HTML that I mentioned, and you will actually, as part of that doc type declaration, you would see a link to this thing called a DTD, which is a document type definition. So if you do see those on pages, the chances are they're very old and probably in need of a refresh. So watch out for those, because these days you should just have this declaration here. It's helpful as developers just to kind of set up a little template to get you going with this stuff. It's a little boilerplate. So at the top of a kind of standard boilerplate bit of HTML, you would have your doc type declaration, your intention to use English as the language, in our case primarily, your intention to use UTF-8 as the character set, and there are other settings as well. I'll come to some of these as we go through these, what's known as meta tags. So let's look at a little diversion. Before we get to HTML5 tags themselves, let's take a little diversion into the world of meta tags. So metadata is data that describes data. And meta tags are used for various reasons on web pages, from SEO, search engine optimizations, to character sets, to some specific ones around social media. So standard ones are things like UTF-8, sets the character encoding on the page, most commonly to UTF-8. There's a tag which is useful for compatibility if you're worried about users on older versions of Internet Explorer. That meta tag there is what will be understood by IE and force it to use the latest rendering engine where possible. And one that you will definitely see is this one here, known as Meta Viewport. We'll look at that when we look at what's known as mobile first development and making web pages mobile friendly. It's responsible for controlling what's known as the layout viewport in mobile devices. When it comes to search engine optimization, SEO, the description meta tag can be used to add a description. Historically, keywords were used, though they've been largely abandoned now because of their abuse. But you can put things in like the author of the document as well. And then I mentioned there are some service specific ones, so Twitter and Facebook, if you look on their documentation, they offer a range of different meta tags that you can add in. What these do is they change the behavior of their application. So if you link to a web page on a Facebook wall, those OG for Open Graph meta tags would change the way the link was displayed to make it more interesting and use the features of the particular social network better. And same with Twitter. So there are some things like Twitter titles and descriptions that you can use for adding things called Twitter cards. So you will find, if you look at some of these social media services, you will find these meta tags in there, and it's a good way of kind of helping promote your pages on these social media platforms if that's something which is key to your kind of marketing strategy. Basic HTML, just to recap some of the stuff that you should have done before, do make sure that you're over these 20 HTML tags. I'm sure you all are. Those for document descriptions, structure, adding content and adding style sheets. Headline one for all that lot, I guess, is the links. So do make sure you're over links. Ending up with 404 pages, file not found, is one of the most common errors in web development. So do make sure that your links are valid and that you understand the difference between relative and absolute links, and then the nuances within the relative world as well. So that's an absolute link because you've got a full web address. That's a relative link because you've just got the name of a file, so the assumption would be you'd look in the same folder to resolve that link. Relative paths can choose to go up a directory, up two directories, and down into a parent, into a other folder. So you're navigating up and down the file structure of your application, or you can be with a /, which means that you find your way to that file from the root of your application. So, so / at the beginning is what's known as a site root relative path. And these are also a good example for other attributes that you can set in this world. So href we saw there for hypertext reference. We can also use a title, which is a little pop-up text when you roll over the link. And then there is targeting as well, where you can have the links open in new tabs or specific windows. Be aware of, well, in the HTML world, that some special characters, things like copyright, trademark, register, they're going to need a little bit more work on your part because you should use HTML entities. So £, for example, don't use a £, on the keyboard. Not everybody will have a £, on the keyboard, so you use the £, semicolon to use a HTML entity. Okay, so back to HTML5 itself then, and semantics. Semantics is the study of meaning, and semantic HTML was all about adding meaning into the code to make it more readable. It's good for accessibility, it's good for search engine optimization, and they're both inline and block elements are represented in the move to semantic HTML. So developers were famous for their div soup, where they had lots of divs with perhaps pertinent IDs and classes, but HTML5 added some elements that had semantics built in. So some of these are things like article, aside, nav for navigation, section for a generic section. You had main, the main content, header as opposed to head, which is a document to do with the structure of the document. Header is actually structuring the information inside of it, and footer, which is fairly obviously understood. So you could take a div soup document that might look like this, with lots of divs, with appropriate IDs named there, but we could change that into something more human readable and certainly more machine readable. So we've got semantics, we've got meaning more readily baked into our code. Examples of inline ones are things like meters to generate this kind of content, progress bars. So this is HTML that's generated this. HTML on its own isn't going to make that progress bar move. You generally need a little bit of JavaScript on top of that to get it to do something. But we don't have to worry about creating the graphics in HTML5. It will do that for us. You can mark something up as being a time. It's not going to change the appearance, but it's about semantics because you're saying to the browser, this is a time here. So it might be useful for search engine to know that. Might be useful for an accessibility or assistive technology to know that, so that it can do something with that data. Mark is just a generic highlighting, and then figure and figure caption, just a pair of elements used to tie together, and I've got a broken image here, but used to tie together an image, a figure with a caption, so a fig caption, so that you can associate text more easily with a certain image. Some of these HTML5 tags have kind of disappeared off the radar, so I'll mention menu here briefly. It only ever was experimental in Firefox, and what it should do in Firefox is this. So here's a little code pen. You see I've got menu and menu item, and when I right click down here it gives me a context menu based on the values that were in here. So please don't try and use this within your web pages, because it is what's known as deprecated. So there's a website called Can I Use? So I should go on here, and if I look at menu, you'll see that it's pretty brutally red flagged across most of the browsers apart from Firefox. So, and it is what's known as a deprecated technology, so you can't really rely on that. Should maybe remove it from the slides. Detail and summary though, they do work. So there's a little code pen, so there's no graphics up there. I just get this little icon by default, this little arrow, and I can show and hide that text just by clicking on here. So just a nice little bit of functionality. This one on the face of it doesn't look too exciting, but we use this all the time. This is what's known as HTML custom attributes, and it's where you and I as developers can just make up the name of something. So replace those X's with whatever you like. So in the example here, I've got data-product ID that I made up, and I can stash away some data in the HTML there. So I can put a product ID in the data, which is really clever, very useful when you're putting together more complex data-driven applications, the ability to hide data that we want to use in our business logic. And this concept is used widely in frameworks as well, as a way of setting various features up. Okay, other major area in HTML5 was new stuff that was added in for forms. So we had forms that had some new attributes that were particularly mobile friendly, so that when we viewed forms on mobile devices, you got keyboards that would pop up that were appropriate for the type of data that was being imported, so it made life much easier for the inputters of the data. So headline ones off is like email and URL, which would give you an appropriate keyboard on your mobile device. Placeholder, let's just show you some of the demos here. So placeholder would give you this text in here, so when I start typing in it disappears. So it helps helps the user be prompted as to what kind of data to put in there. There are things like range for sliders, so that's just been done by the browser for me, no JavaScript, and then input type date famously gives you date picker, and there are ones like color which give you a color picker. Now if I shove that into a different browser, you'll see that will look slightly different. So there's the range, there's the date picker in Firefox, and there's the color. You see it's actually thrown a color picker off screen there. So these things will look different because they're generated by the browser. The specification tells the browser to do something with them, but quite how they implement that depends on each browser's implementation. Telephone for numbers, range you saw for the slide, and date color, we've seen those. And then the other big area was multimedia. You've seen this before, but just very quickly, you have the ability to add audio and video directly without the plugin. That was what Steve Jobs was kind of railing about in Thoughts on Flash. So you have audio with various attributes like the source and the control and the autoplay and the loop. So you can add audio in and you'll get the audio player. The appearance of the audio player, because that's developed by the browser, well, is dependent on the browser, so it will look slightly different in the different browsers. So I'm in Chrome here, and it will look like that for audio.
if you've got two sources, it's because you wanted to try this one first. If it's not supported, it'll try the second one. So it's a little bit kind of historical, that, because it used to be that Firefox wouldn't support MPEGs and MP3s, but I do believe it will now. So they did have this OGG format in there. Yeah, so older versions of Firefox didn't, but they do now support that format. Similarly, in the video world, you've got a similar set of attributes. It's like posters are useful for kind of placeholders, controls and loops. And again, we historically went through a period where there was issues around the video format, but most browsers now are supporting H.264 and its various codecs. So you'll see you've got good support there right across the board. Firefox initially reluctant to support that for copyright reasons on those particular formats. Okay, so there's some links there to these slides will be on appropriate places as well, so some links there to help you revise some of the other topics from last year on HTML and CSS. Hopefully that's giving you a little bit of context as to where HTML came from and what HTML5 brings to the party. Thank you.